this episode, Agnes answers your questions about farming foibles, marketing mishaps, or personal predicaments. Email agnesanswers@gmail.com to receive audio advice from agriculture's agony aunt. Now, here's Agnes.
Yes, here's Agnes. I am Agnes, the audio advice giver for agriculturalists. This is the Agnes Answers podcast, and the way this is going to work, folks, is in each episode we're going to have two questions. So two advice seekers are going to come and ask, "Dear Agnes, will you help me with this?" And each episode is going to have one of those questions. Is going to be something maybe financially or businessy or markety or kind of a serious topic in that matter. And one other question is going to be more of a personal question or interpersonal problems, equally serious problems in their own way. So the first question that we address in this first episode of Agnes Answers is going to be one of those serious interpersonal questions. Let's jump right into it.
Dear Agnes, my husband and I got married in March, and my best friend from childhood traveled halfway across the country to be at our wedding. Her wedding is at the end of this month, and it would mean the world to me to go. However, I work for my husband in a seasonal industry, and it's our busiest time of the year. I have been clear since my friend sent out her save the dates that it was important to me to attend, and originally my husband was supportive and even talked about going with me. Now he feels like he can't go and doesn't want me to go either. In his defense, I have a hard time keeping up with all my duties, and his credit just took a hit because I was late on a payment. However, in my defense, I am often in the field for 9 or 10 hours a day and trying to manage billing, scheduling, and housework, evenings and weekends. I'm curious for your thoughts. Is it reasonable to insist on attending this wedding in spite of the mistakes I've made? Or should I just accept this as my consequences for missing the payment? Signed, Wedding Travel Blues.
Okay, there is a lot to unpack here. I think on the one hand, you've got sort of this reasonable scheduling question, and reasonable from both sides, is whether or not this person should leave the family business during a busy time of year. And on the other hand, you've got this weird kind of toxic relationship almost forming between a wife and her husband. So we're going to unpack both of those things. But first, I feel it's important that I should make sort of a confession here. So this is the first episode of the Agnes Answers podcast, and obviously I didn't have any initial questions coming into me in the first place. So what I've done here is I've poached a question from another advice columnist. If you guys have ever read the Dear Prudence column on slate.com, that's definitely 100% my favorite advice columnist that's out there working today. You know, there's been a lot of good ones out there in the past. There's Ann Landers and Ask Amy, and, well, Dear Prudence is definitely the best. But this came up in a live discussion on slate.com this July, so July 2018. And the moment that I read this question, I knew, hey, that lady is a farmer. And it really brought home to me why we need an agriculture-specific advice podcast. So, Wedding Travel Blues here writes, I work for my husband in a seasonal industry, and it's our busy time of year. Okay, to the general population, that could mean any number of things. And this answer about going to the wedding is just obviously, of course you should go to the wedding. Forget about your crabby husband. Go to the wedding. But, you know, in the agriculture industry, there are so many of these family farms where the answer is not that easy. These two may be the only people on earth who are capable of getting in the product for that entire business's fiscal year in a very short and specific amount of time. It is probably not trivial that Wedding Travel Blues is asking this question of whether or not she should go. This is something that is different about the agriculture industry, that is not the same way in most other industries, and why I think Wedding Travel Blues' question belongs here in the Agnes Answers podcast, perhaps more appropriately than in the Dear Prudence column. So my answer is probably going to still be pretty much the same as Dear Prudence's answer, which is basically, yeah, of course you should go. Because yes, of course she should go. There is a precedent that she needs to set. they've only been married since March, and her friend's wedding has been on the books this whole time. Yes, her husband may be the one in charge of the farm's schedule, but she probably needs to put her foot down now and say that she's in charge of her own personal life schedule. That has to be a precedent that you set now, otherwise it's going to be a long and probably unpleasant marriage. It is her life, right? If it's not her life, whose is it? So yes, she should go. But I will say that I understand the angst here, and I think the compromise, or the way to couch this conversation, this upcoming conversation with her husband would be to acknowledge that things like this should not go on the schedule in future years. So if this is perhaps wheat harvest in Nebraska, which would be this July timeframe that she's talking about, you might say, no, I won't be able to go to any future friends' weddings in any future Julys. And that is going to be a pretty big sacrifice. You never know what might come up in any future July. I know lots of farmers who have skipped their grandchildren's graduations for planting season, right? Or weddings get skipped for things. And that's not fun. It's not pleasant. And perhaps it's a little bit unreasonable. Some of these people get a little bit too workaholic and too bound up when they could probably skip one day in their harvest or their planting or whatever the case may be. But I think it is a sacrifice that a lot of farm families make. And it's something that wedding travel blues is probably going to have to come to grips with. And that's just going to be the way it's going to be in future years. Also, every farm should have some kind of a backup plan so that sick days can be a real thing, or travel to your childhood friends' wedding days or funeral days or whatever. So this is a wake-up call for wedding travel blues and her husband, that the two of them need to sort this out and build in a plan and build in some redundancy for their labor supply. You know, the proverbial question is, what if somebody gets hit by a bus? There's got to be some kind of a backup. But for now, of course she should go. Of course she should go to her friend's wedding. Okay, so I wasn't totally sure that the Dear Prudence column would get the implications of this situation for an agriculture scenario. But my advice is pretty much exactly what Prudence said too. And since I ripped this off from Slate.com, I'll just go ahead and read the advice that Dear Prudence gave too. She said, I'm a little concerned that both you and your husband seem to be framing this as something you are either going to be, quote, allowed to do, or something you will be forbidden from doing as punishment for making mistakes at work. It would be one thing if you two were making the decision together, even if you had to make a tough call in order to prioritize your business. But I think you should both steer clear of the consequences angle and figure out if there's a reasonable way you two can work around an absence of 2 or 3 days while you travel to your best friend's wedding. You can figure out how to keep the trip as short as possible, get as much work done in advance as possible, and let the housework wait for a few days, or let your husband handle it in your absence. If there's a bigger picture conversation to be had about your workload and whether your present situation is sustainable, that should be had separately from the question of attending this particular wedding. Missing 2 days of work to fly to a wedding is unlikely to be the sole deciding factor in whether your business is successful, and I think you should do your best to make your attendance possible. Agnes Answers is a member of the Global Ag Network. Go visit globalagnetwork.com to see their full roster of lots of great podcasts and content. Obviously, you like podcasts and you like agriculture, so you will be sure to find new podcasts to listen to on the Global Ag Network. For instance, like Ag News Daily, which is just a perfect little dose of what's going on in the ag world, delivered every day of the week. So go check out Global Ag Network.